A third factoring technique is called grouping, and you use this when you see a series of 4 terms. And I hope that each of you sees in this expression 4 distinct terms. So what you do with grouping, well, first you look for a common factor, but as you notice, if you look through, there is no common factor in all 4 of these terms. There's no common 5, no common 3, there's no common x, there's no common y. So that would be the first thing you would check for. But since I see no GCF, then I'm going to try grouping. And again, an easy way to recognize this is when you see 4 terms. That's generally when you're going to be using grouping. So the way you do this is you actually sort of turn this into 2 little separate problems. We're going to group the first 2, separate them with a plus, and group the second 2, and then try my greatest common factor process twice. So on the first 2, I see in common an x, which I'm going to pull out in front. That leaves a y plus 5 inside the parentheses. In the second 2, I see a common factor of 3, which is also going to leave a y plus 5. And you remember from the ones that we just did, those common parentheses, I'm going to pull that out in front. And the x plus 3, which remain, are the pieces that go into the second parentheses. And sometimes students ask me, is it okay if I write it in the opposite order? And of course it's fine, because multiplication is commutative, which means you can turn the order around and still get the same result. So I'm going to scroll down and try another one here that's a little more complicated. Again, I see 4 terms. Again, I do not see a common factor throughout all 4 of these terms. I see some common factors in some of the terms, but not all of the terms, so there is no GCF. You should always check for that first. So we're going to try grouping. All right, so as I look at the first pair of numbers, let's see, what do I see in common with a 16 and a 28? I think that's going to be a 4. And again, we go for the lowest exponent on the variables, so I'm seeing a 4x squared, which leaves a 4x minus 7. I'm doing a lot in my head there. In common on the next pair, I see just the number 3, which also leaves a 4x minus 7. And again, you see these common parentheses. So you write that out in front and pick up the remaining pieces from these terms that sit out in front of the parentheses. Okay, so sometimes you can run into a little bit of a problem with these, with the signs, when that middle term is a minus sign. Here's the way I like to handle it. So again, I looked for a GCF. I don't see one. So I'm going to try grouping. Now notice how I stuck this plus in the middle just to keep them separated for a moment, the parentheses separated, and I made sure to keep the negative sign attached to the 10x. Okay, so let me, oops, I see a mistake. This was supposed to be a 2x to the third there. So on the first pair, the first binomial, I look for the lowest exponent there, and it's a 2. And over here, when I have this lead term that's negative, remember we said we would always factor out a negative value. So I'm seeing a common 5, but I'm going to factor out a negative 5. And the result is it reverses these signs in here. We talked about that in an earlier one. So where I had a negative, positive, now I've got a positive, negative. And the reason we did that, again, is so that we would have these common parentheses. Whoops, I didn't want to do that in red. Whoops, I didn't want to do that in red again. There we go. And the last one I wanted to try, let me scroll down here. Again, you will always want to look through to see if you see a GCF, and I do not see a GCF. That should always be your first process. So I'm going to try grouping because I see four terms here. So again, I'm going to group, oops, when I group those two, whoa, I don't see anything at all in common, do you? So let's try another way. How about if I grouped 5xy and 3vy, and let's say I separate here and I group 6uv minus 10ux. I don't know, let's see what's going to happen there. So what I see in common in this first pair is y. And what I see in common in the second pair, let me look at that, is 2u, which leaves 3v minus 5x. Oops, I'm almost there. Notice how these parentheses are almost the same, but the signs are different. One is a positive 3v and the other one's a negative 3v. So I think what I'm going to do is go back and write one more line here. And instead of pulling out a positive 2u, I'm going to pull out a negative 2u. And the effect of that, remember, is to reverse the signs. And now I have parentheses that match, so I'm happy. They're in reverse order, but they still match. The positive is with the 5x and the negative is with the 3v. So I'm going to start off with the common parentheses and then end up with the pieces that are left out in front of those common parentheses. I hope that helps with the grouping.